5 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea, USS Carl Vinson, was already carving a hard turn to the northeast when the first alarm shattered the pre-dawn silence of the flag bridge. For 3 weeks, the carrier had shadowed the Iranian coast in a tense game of tactical cat and mouse, but the signature now blooming on the radar was not a single reconnaissance aircraft or a lone patrol boat. Something was surging off the coast of Bandar Abbas that looked like a solid wall of electronic noise, and no one in the Combat Direction Center knew if the ship's defensive layers could cycle fast enough to stop it. The morning air was heavy with humidity and the faint, metallic scent of ozone from the massive ANSPY-1 radar arrays. Below the flight deck, the hull groaned under the strain of 30 knots, the dark water of the Arabian Sea churning into a wide, white wake of foam. Inside the Combat Direction Center, the atmosphere was a controlled, high-pressure hum. Petty Officer Second Class Miller stared at his console, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the Aegis Combat System. He had spent 4 years tracking routine flights and regional exercises, but what he was seeing now was a statistical impossibility. The screen was saturated with 124 individual contacts, all of them moving at 160 kilometers per hour. They were flying low, barely 15 meters above the wavetops, hugging the curvature of the Earth to hide from long-range detection. Bridge. Combat. Miller's voice was tight but professional. We have a massive inbound swarm, bearing 045, range 60 miles, and closing. These are not manned aircraft. Repeat. We have a saturation drone mech in progress. The commanding officer of USS Carl Vinson stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun had not yet begun to break. He did not need to see the targets to feel the weight of the situation. A swarm of this size was designed for one purpose: to overwhelm the brain of the ship. Even the most advanced computer systems in the world had limits. If the defense was off by even 1%, the carrier would take a hit that could mission kill the centerpiece of Carrier Strike Group 1. General Quarters. General Quarters. The overhead speakers blared, the rhythmic gong of the alarm echoing through every deck and compartment. All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. Throughout the ship, 5,000 sailors moved with practiced, frantic precision. Watertight doors slammed shut and were dogged down. In the ready rooms, pilots scrambled for their gear, though the window for a flight deck launch was closing by the second. On the flight deck itself, the yellow-shirted handlers moved clear as the massive elevators hummed, bringing more missiles to the surface. The E-2 Delta Hawkeye circling 100 miles to the east provided the overhead view that confirmed the nightmare. The drone swarm was not a random cloud. It was organized into 3 distinct waves. The first wave was designed to draw the ship's long-range missiles. The second wave carried electronic jammers to blind the ship's sensors. The third wave, the largest of all, was the killing blow carrying high-explosive warheads intended to shred the carrier's thin-skinned superstructure. Range 50 miles, the tactical action officer reported. The cruiser USS Princeton and the destroyer USS Hopper are requesting weapons free. They have a solid track on the first wave. The captain gripped the edge of the command table. The rules of engagement had changed the moment those drones crossed the maritime boundary. This was no longer a diplomatic standoff. It was a battle for survival in the most congested waters on the planet. The iron shield of the United States Navy was about to be tested against a swarm of plastic and gasoline that cost less than a single one of the carrier's interceptors. Grant weapons free to all escorts, the captain ordered. Engage the lead wave with Standard Missile 6. I want those drones out of the sky before they get within 20 miles of this hull. Outside, the first streaks of dawn began to touch the sky, but the light was quickly overshadowed by the brilliant orange-white plumes of missile launches from the surrounding escorts. The air began to vibrate with the low-frequency roar of rocket motors, and the smell of burnt propellant drifted across the flight deck. The engagement had begun, but the main mass of the swarm was still coming, and they were closing the distance at nearly 3 kilometers every minute. 5:15 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea, approximately 60 miles south of the Iranian coastline. USS Carl Vinson was not in these waters by accident or routine patrol. For the last 72 hours, intelligence reports from the Indo-Pacific Command had indicated a massive mobilization of drone assets at the Iranian base near Bandar Abbas. The presence of the carrier strike group was a direct response to a series of threats against commercial shipping lanes in the Gulf of Oman, where 30% of the world's seaborne oil passes through every day. The air around the carrier strike group was heavy with the scent of diesel and the constant, low-frequency hum of high-powered radar systems sweeping the horizon. The sea state was calm, with waves less than 1 meter, providing the perfect backdrop for the infrared sensors of the incoming swarm to track the heat signatures of the massive American warships. The geopolitical tension had reached a breaking point 3 days earlier when a commercial tanker was harassed by fast attack boats. The United States Navy had moved Carrier Strike Group 1 into a holding box at coordinates 24 degrees north, 58 degrees east. This position allowed the strike group to provide a protective umbrella over the shipping lanes while remaining in international waters. But it also placed them well within the strike range of Iran's newest generation of low-cost, high-volume loitering munitions. The swarm now closing on the Vinson was composed of a mix of Ababil-3 and Shahed-136 variants. These were not sophisticated stealth platforms, but they were never intended to be. Their strength lay in their sheer numbers. By launching over 100 units simultaneously, the Iranian planners hoped to saturate the Mark 41 vertical launch systems of the American escorts, forcing the strike group to expend millions of dollars in interceptors against targets that cost less than a used car. On the bridge of the cruiser CG-59 USS Princeton, the commanding officer monitored the Cooperative Engagement Capability link. This system allowed the Princeton to act as the primary air defense commander for the entire strike group, sharing radar data in real time. With the destroyer DDG-70 USS Hopper and the Carl Vinson itself, the screen showed the first wave of 20 drones crossing the 50-mile mark. The objective of the adversary is clear, the tactical action officer remarked, his voice steady over the internal comms. They want us to empty our magazines on the small stuff so they can follow up with heavy anti-ship cruise missiles. We have to be selective about what we engage and when. The strategy for the strike group was a layered defense, often referred to as the shield of the fleet. The outermost layer was the E-2 Delta Hawkeye, providing early warning. The middle layer consisted of the Standard Missile 6 and Standard Missile 2 interceptors fired from the Mark 41 vertical launch systems of the escorts. The final, inner layer was the close-in weapon system and the rolling airframe missiles, mounted directly on the hull of the Carl Vinson. As the first wave of drones reached a distance of 45 miles, the USS Princeton and the USS Hopper began their systematic response. The deck of the Princeton shuddered as the first two Standard Missile 6 interceptors cleared the forward launch cells. The roar of the rocket motors was a physical weight in the air, a sound that could be felt in the marrow of the sailors' bones. The missiles streaked into the dawn sky, leaving white trails of smoke that hung in the humid air like jagged scars. These interceptors were designed to engage targets beyond the horizon, guided by the Hawkeye's radar data. 6 seconds after launch, the first two drones in the Iranian formation vanished from the radar screen as the Standard missiles found their marks. But behind those first two targets, 80 more signatures remained. The Iranian controllers were staggering the altitudes of the drones, some skimming the waves at 10 meters, while others climbed to 500 meters to complicate the firing solutions for the American computers. The strategic context of the engagement was rapidly shifting from a show of force to a high-stakes battle of attrition. Every missile fired by the Americans was a precious resource, and the swarm was only halfway to its target. The sun began to crest the horizon, casting a long, golden light across the flight deck of the Vinson. It illuminated the faces of the crew as they watched the horizon, where the distant flashes of interceptions signaled that the shield was holding, for now. But the sheer volume of the incoming threat meant that the inner layers of the defense would soon be called into action. 5:20 in the morning, 25,000 feet above the North Arabian Sea. Inside the pressurized, cramped cabin of the E-2 Delta Hawkeye, The air was cool and smelled of ozone and the steady, dry output of high-capacity cooling fans. The three mission systems officers sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes locked onto the circular glass displays of the ANAPY-9 radar system. Above them, the massive 24-foot rotodome hummed, with a rhythmic vibration that pulsed through the entire fuselage of the aircraft. They were the quarterbacks of the entire strike group, and right now, the field was flooded with players. The senior mission commander adjusted his headset, his voice a calm monotone, against the backdrop of the engine drone. On his screen, 124 amber triangles moved in a jagged, staggered formation. The Hawkeye was feeding this data directly to the USS Carl Vinson and its escorts via the Link 16 digital data link, creating a single, unified picture of the battlefield that stretched across hundreds of miles of open ocean. All stations, this is Hawkeye 01, the commander said. We have high-confidence tracks on the primary swarm. The targets are maintaining a low-altitude profile at 15 meters. They are utilizing a staggered column approach to mask their numbers from surface-based radar. Below the Hawkeye, the destroyer USS Hopper, designated DDG-70, was plowing through the swells at 32 knots. The forward deck was perpetually slick with salt spray, the white foam of the Arabian Sea crashing over the bow as the ship drove hard into the wind. Inside its combat information center, the Aegis weapon system was processing the data fed from the Hawkeye above. The destroyer was the tip of the spear for the defensive perimeter, positioned 15 miles ahead of the carrier to act as a physical and electronic barrier. The tactical action officer on the Hopper watched as the Aegis system automatically assigned firing solutions to the incoming threats. The computer was prioritizing the drones based on their speed and heading, looking for the ones that posed the most immediate danger to the Carl Vinson. The air in the compartment was tense, filled with the clicking of keyboards and the low-level chatter of sailors confirming system readiness. Hopper has a solid track on the second wave, the weapons officer reported. Mark 41 vertical launch system is energized. We have 24 Standard Missile 2 interceptors queued for immediate release. The defensive perimeter was a delicate balance of geometry and timing. If the Hopper fired too early, the drones might maneuver out of the intercept zone. If the ship waited too long, the sheer volume of the swarm would reach the dead zone where the long-range missiles could no longer track. The strategy was to thin the herd, forcing the swarm to break its coordinated formation and allowing the shorter-range systems to pick off the survivors. At 5:25 in the morning, the order was given. The forward deck of the naval destroyer erupted in a spectacular display of fire and smoke. 4 military interceptors launched in rapid succession, cleared the cells in less than 2 seconds, and accelerated to Mach 3. The heat from the rocket motors was so intense that it instantly vaporized the salt spray on the deck, creating a cloud of white steam that trailed behind the rising missiles. The sailors on the bridge of the Hopper could feel the vibration of the launches in their chests, a deep, rhythmic thudding that signaled the ship was fighting back. On the radar screens, the 4 interceptors climbed high into the atmosphere before arcing back down toward the horizon, guided by the invisible hand of the radar aircraft overhead. The first interceptions occurred 40 miles out. 4 amber triangles on the mission commander's screen flickered and then vanished. There were no Hollywood explosions at this distance, only the silent removal of data points from a computer screen. But for the crew of the radar aircraft and the naval destroyer, it was the first proof that the shield was functional. Good hits on Wave 1, the mission commander noted, his fingers dancing across his console. But look at the third wave. They are dropping even lower. They are almost touching the water. Hopper, be advised. You are going to lose radar lock on the trailing edge of the swarm. In approximately 3 minutes, you will need to transition to infrared tracking. The drones were adapting. The armed forces on the coast were likely watching the same engagement via satellite or long-range sensors, and they were shifting their tactics in real time. The swarm began to spread out, moving from a tight column into a wide crescent shape designed to flank the destroyer and approach the aircraft carrier from multiple angles at once. The defensive perimeter was holding, but the complexity of the attack was increasing faster than the interceptors could be launched. The North Arabian Sea was no longer a quiet expanse of dark water. It was a grid of electronic warfare, supersonic missiles, and low-flying suicide drones. The sun was now fully above the horizon, reflecting off the white smoke trails that crisscrossed the sky. A visual record of a battle that was only just beginning to reach its most dangerous phase. 5:30 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea, 40 miles off the Iranian coast. The cruiser CG-59 USS Princeton was now the primary executor of the strike group's long-range defense. On the forward and aft decks, the hatches of the Mark 41 vertical launch system flipped open with a metallic clang that was swallowed by the roar of the sea. Within seconds, the first 4 Standard Missile-6 interceptors ignited, their rocket motors creating a localized sun on the deck of the cruiser. Each missile transitioned from a vertical climb to a horizontal intercept path in a tight, aggressive arc, leaving a lingering smell of burnt cordite and high-temperature exhaust hanging over the ship. The air around the Princeton was alive with the screaming of wind and the constant, rhythmic thumping of the ship's hull meeting the northwesterly swells. The sea spray, whipped into a fine mist by the 30-knot speed of the vessel, was illuminated by the orange-white plumes of the outgoing interceptors. Inside the Combat Information Center of the Princeton, the Air Defense Commander monitored the trajectories of the Standard Missile-6 salvos. These missiles were the most advanced interceptors in the military forces inventory, capable of hitting targets at extreme ranges by utilizing active radar seekers. The mission was to cull the swarm before it could consolidate into a singular, overwhelming mass. The Aegis Combat System was processing over 2,000 data points every second, calculating the exact millisecond each interceptor needed to detonate its blast fragmentation warhead. Standard Missile-6 away. Rounds 1 through 4. The weapons officer called out. Time to intercept is 45 seconds. Radar tracks are stable. We have a 60% probability of kill on the lead elements of Wave 2. The drones of the second wave were flying in a tight, staggered V formation, designed to mimic the radar signature of a large manned aircraft. This was a tactical deception meant to trick the American computers into wasting multiple missiles on a single cluster. However, the NIFC-CA architecture, the Naval Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air System, linked the Princeton's computers with the Hawkeye overhead, allowing the system to see through the clutter and identify each individual drone with surgical precision. At coordinates 24 degrees 40 minutes north, 59 degrees 10 minutes east, the first interceptions of the second wave occurred. At 40 miles out, the Standard Missile-6 interceptors met their targets. There was no sound at this distance, only the sudden disappearance of 12 amber triangles from the tactical display. The drones, constructed of carbon fiber and light alloys, simply disintegrated under the pressure of the supersonic shockwaves and the thousands of tungsten pellets released by the interceptor warheads. 12 confirmed kills on Wave 2, Miller reported from the Carl Vinson Center. But the third wave is accelerating. They have increased speed to 200 kilometers per hour. They're coming in behind the debris cloud of the second wave to mask their final approach. The Iranian tactics were proving sophisticated. By using the wreckage and smoke of their own destroyed drones as a temporary radar screen, the third wave was able to close the gap to 30 miles before the Princeton could reset its firing solutions. This was the largest group of all 65 loitering munitions, each one packed with 30 kilograms of high explosives. The tension on the bridge of the Carl Vinson was palpable. The captain watched the digital range to intercept clock counting down. The long-range shield had done its job, thinning the swarm from over 100 to roughly 70 targets, but the leakers were now entering the medium-range envelope. The destroyer USS Hopper was already preparing its Standard Missile-2 blocks, but the window for long-range engagement was rapidly closing. The sun was now a blinding disk on the horizon, turning the sea into a shimmering field of gold that made visual tracking difficult for the lookouts. The environment was a beautiful, deceptive mask for the wall of steel and fire that was moving toward the carrier at 3 kilometers per minute. The strike group had transitioned from a long-distance chess match to a close-quarters knife fight, and the Carl Vinson itself was about to become the primary combatant. 5:40 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea. USS Carl Vinson was no longer just a spectator to the distant flashes on the horizon. The carrier had increased speed to 32 knots, the 4 massive bronze propellers churning the dark water into a violent, frothing wake that stretched for miles behind the stern. The ship was leaning into a hard turn, the flight deck tilting at a noticeable angle as the navigator fought to keep the bow pointed into the wind while presenting the smallest possible profile to the incoming threat. The air on the flight deck was thick with the heavy, chemical smell of JP-5 jet fuel and the sharp tang of salt spray. 2 EA-18 Golf Growlers were already in the air, orbiting 3,000 feet above the strike group. These electronic warfare aircraft were flooding the sky with high-powered radio frequency interference, attempting to sever the command and link signals between the drones and their shore-based controllers. Inside the carrier's electronic warfare suite, the ANSLQ-32 operators watched as their screens turned into a chaotic mess of overlapping signal bars. They were projecting a digital ghost of the Carl Vinson, trying to trick the drone's onboard sensors into targeting a patch of empty ocean 5 miles to the west. Electronic jamming is active, the electronic warfare officer reported, his voice tight. We have successfully diverted 14 targets from the lead element of the third wave. They are breaking formation and spiraling into the water, but the remaining 42 drones have switched to autonomous optical homing. They don't need a radio link anymore. They are looking for the shape of a carrier. The swarm was now 20 miles away and closing. The long-range interceptors from the escorts had done significant damage, but the sheer volume of the attack was beginning to tell. The leakers, the drones that had survived the standard missile salvos, were now entering the inner defensive envelope. This was the space where the carrier would have to defend itself. The ship's hull vibrated with a new, high-frequency hum as the Mark 29 launchers for the evolved Sea Sparrow missiles powered up. These were the medium-range teeth of the carrier's self-defense system. Unlike the long-range missiles fired from the cruisers, these were meant for high-speed, last-ditch interceptions. The tactical action officer looked at the captain. Permission to engage with evolved Sea Sparrow missiles and rolling airframe missiles. Targets are at 12 miles. Take them all, the captain replied. Clear the sky. The engagement shifted into a new, more violent phase. From the starboard and port quarters of the Carl Vinson, the evolved Sea Sparrow missiles began to launch in pairs. The sound was a series of sharp, whip-like cracks that echoed through the steel corridors of the ship. Each missile left, the launcher in a blur of white light, accelerating so fast that the human eye could barely track it before it vanished into the morning haze. The drone swarm responded by dropping even lower, some of them flying so close to the water that their prop wash left visible trails on the surface of the sea. They were no longer a cloud, they were a coordinated line of attackers, hugging the waves to stay below the minimum depression angle of the carrier's radar. The tension in the Combat Direction Center was at a breaking point. The radar screen showed the 42 targets converging. At 10 miles, the ship's automatic defense systems took over. The computer was now making decisions in microseconds, calculating which drone posed the greatest threat of impact. The first of the evolved Sea Sparrow missiles met its target at 8 miles. The drone, a Shahed-136 packed with explosives, was struck head-on. The result was a brilliant orange fireball that hung in the air for a fraction of a second, before the wreckage plummeted into the sea. But for every drone destroyed, another 3 seemed to push forward through the smoke. The environment around the ship was now a surreal landscape of white smoke trails, orange flashes, and the constant, thudding vibration of the hull. As the ship's own weapons fired, the sun, now fully up, revealed the grim reality of the situation. The horizon was dotted with dozens of small, black shapes, all of them screaming toward the carrier at 200 kilometers per hour. "Targets at 5 miles," the lookout shouted over the ship's internal circuit. "I have visual." Multiple inbounds on the starboard side. The rolling airframe missile launchers, located on the corners of the flight deck, began to slew rapidly. These missiles, designed to track the heat and radio signatures of incoming threats, were the last line of defense before the guns. The sailors on the deck could hear the mechanical whine of the launchers as they locked on. The battle had reached the inner sanctuary of the strike group. The Carl Vinson was fighting for its life, and the 8 minutes that followed would determine the fate of the 5,000 souls on board. 5:45 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea. At coordinates 24 degrees 41 minutes north, 59 degrees 12 minutes east, the final layer of the American shield was no longer a matter of long-range mathematics. It was a matter of raw, kinetic iron. The drone swarm had been thinned by the outer escorts, but 32 loitering munitions had survived the gauntlet and were now inside the 5-mile perimeter of the USS Carl Vinson. The carrier's massive hull, nearly 1,100 feet of hardened steel, leaned hard to port as the ship executed a violent emergency maneuver to clear the firing arcs for its sponson-mounted weapon systems. The air around the ship was suddenly saturated with the deafening, high-pitched scream of the Phalanx close-in weapon system. The 3 mounts computer-controlled 20mm Gatling guns began to track the incoming targets with terrifying speed. The smell of burnt cordite and hot machine oil flooded the upper decks as the first mount on the starboard quarter opened fire. The trigger was squeezed by the automated combat system. A 3-second burst of 450 armor-piercing tungsten rounds shrieked off the mount, creating a solid beam of white-hot tracers that reached out toward the horizon. The sound was not the rhythmic thumping of a traditional machine gun, but a continuous, mechanical roar like a giant zipper being torn open at the speed of sound. The heat blast from the muzzle washed across the catwalks, the temperature jumping 20 degrees in an instant as the spent brass casings clattered into the collection chutes like a metallic hailstorm. 2 miles out, the lead drone of the final wave, an Ababil-3 carrying a 20-kilogram shaped charge warhead, was caught in the stream of fire. The 20mm rounds punched straight through the plastic composite nose cone, shattering the optical sensor before driving into the fuel tank and the engine block. The drone did not simply catch fire. It erupted instantly into a cloud of jagged fragments and burning gasoline. The impact sent a spray of debris skidding across the surface of the water for 50 meters. But the main mass of the explosion was swallowed by the sea. The remaining drones did not falter. They adjusted their headings, sensing the defensive fire, and began a terminal dive from 300 meters. The crew of the Carl Vinson felt the entire ship shudder as the port-side close-in weapon system joined the fray. The vibration was a deep, bone-shaking resonance that rattled the teeth of the sailors in the engine room's 10 decks below. "Brace for impact, starboard side," the bridge officer screamed over the 1MC general announcing system. One drone, smoking from a partial hit, managed to clear the stream of tracers. It was aiming for the carrier's primary flight control tower. The pilot of the drone, operating from a shore station over 100 miles away, pushed the nose down into a final, vertical plunge. But the rolling airframe missile launcher on the aft sponson fired a single, spiraling interceptor at a range of only 1,500 meters. The interceptor slammed into the drone's fuselage at Mach 2. The detonation was so close that the blast wave threw 3 sailors on the flight deck off their feet, the overpressure compressing their chests and momentarily knocking the wind from their lungs. A fireball that bleached the sky white erupted less than a mile from the ship's island, sending a rain of hot, blackened carbon fiber down onto the non-skid surface of the deck. Black smoke rose from the dozens of wreckage sites now littering the water around the carrier. For exactly 8 minutes, the air had been a solid web of tracers and interceptors. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind whipping across the flight deck and the steady, rhythmic wash of the sea against the hull. The burning pieces of the swarm were still bobbing on the surface, hissing as the salt water extinguished the last of the Iranian fuel. "Check fire. Check fire," the tactical action officer commanded. "All mounts to standby. Evaluate the horizon for a second wave." The sensors on the Carl Vinson began a slow, systematic sweep. The radar screen, which had been a solid wall of hostile signatures only minutes before, was now clear. On the flight deck, the damage control teams moved out in their silver proximity suits, checking for spot fires from the falling debris. The smell of burning oil and ozone lingered in the humid morning air, a physical reminder of how close the steel behemoth had come to taking a mortal blow. The carrier had survived the saturation attack. Of the 124 drones launched, not a single one had reached the hull. However, the cost of the defense was staggering. In those 8 minutes, the strike group had expended over $200 million in sophisticated missiles and ammunition. The lockers for the close-in weapon systems were nearly empty, and the crew knew that the Iranian forces on the coast were likely already preparing their next move. The sun was now high enough to reveal the full extent of the battlefield. The Arabian Sea was no longer a pristine blue. It was a graveyard of twisted metal and shimmering oil slicks. The Carl Vinson continued its turn, its white wake cutting through the debris as it prepared to transition from a defensive posture to an offensive one. The shield had held, but the sword was now being unsheathed. 6 in the morning. The deep interior of the USS Carl Vinson. The battle above the waterline had lasted 8 minutes, but for the sailors of the GON and G3 divisions, the real war was only just beginning. Below the armored flight deck, in the cavernous, fluorescent-lit ammunition handling rooms, the air was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid, stale coffee, and the salt-heavy humidity of the Arabian Sea. The temperature in the lower magazines had climbed to nearly 90 degrees, as the massive cooling systems struggled to keep up with the heat generated by the rapid cycling of the ship's primary weapon systems. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez stood at the center of the magazine 4 handling area, his uniform dark with sweat. His eyes were fixed on the digital inventory board, which now flashed a series of amber warnings. The carrier's 3 close-in weapon system mounts had expended over 12,000 rounds of tungsten ammunition in less than 10 minutes. The rolling airframe missile launchers were down to 20% capacity, and the Mark 29 cells for the Sea Sparrow missiles were almost entirely empty. "Move it, people," Rodriguez shouted, his voice echoing off the steel bulkheads. "The shield is down to the bone. If another wave hits us before we reset these loaders, we are defending this ship with small arms and prayers. I want those 20mm drums on the elevators now." The logistics of defending a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier against a saturation attack was a brutal exercise in physics and endurance. Each drum of ammunition for the close-in weapon system weighed nearly 500 pounds. The sailors worked in teams of 4, using manual hoists and heavy-duty carts to navigate the narrow, vibrating corridors of the ship. Every time the Carl Vinson leaned into a turn, the heavy carts threatened to break loose, requiring the crews to use their own body weight to stabilize the lethal cargo. On the flight deck, the scene was equally frantic, but more visible. Damage control teams in their yellow and red jerseys moved through the dissipating smoke, scanning the non-skid surface for foreign object debris. A single piece of a destroyed foreign drone, no larger than a coin, could be sucked into a jet engine and cause a multi-million-dollar crash. The deck was littered with blackened shards of carbon fiber and small, jagged pieces of aluminum that crunched under the boots of the sailors. Near the aft elevator, a specialized team worked to assess the thermal damage to the starboard rolling airframe missile launcher. The heat from the rapid-fire launches had warped the composite blast shield. A technician, wearing heavy gloves, carefully inspected the seeker windows on the remaining missiles. "Launcher 2 is fouled with carbon scoring," the technician reported over his radio. "We need a fresh cleaning kit and a secondary sensor calibration. We are effectively blind on the starboard quarter until we get these optics cleared." While the physical repairs were underway, the tactical action officer in the PAD, Combat Direction Center, was performing a different kind of calculation: the cost of the engagement. The strike group had successfully defended the carrier, but the asymmetric nature of the battle was sobering. The foreign forces had expended roughly $2 million worth of low-cost drones, In response, the military forces had fired nearly $240 million worth of interceptors and precision ammunition. "It is a mathematical siege," the officer remarked to the captain. "They are trying to bankrupt our magazines. We have enough standard missiles for maybe 2 more engagements of this scale before the escorts are Winchester. We need the supply ships to meet us at the rendezvous point 4 hours early." The logistics chain for the strike group extended thousands of miles back to the remote naval base and the foreign port. The supply ship was already 300 miles to the south, pushing its engines to the limit to reach the aircraft carrier. The replenishment at sea would be a high-risk operation, requiring the carrier to maintain a steady course and speed for hours while fuel lines and ammunition pallets were transferred between ships, moving in parallel, all while still within the strike range of the foreign coast. The sun was now fully up, the harsh light revealing the true toll of the morning's work. The sailors were exhausted, their movements slowing as the adrenaline of the combat faded and the reality of the labor set in. But there was no time for rest. In the magazines, the heavy clank of steel on steel continued as the elevators rose toward the surface, carrying the fresh iron needed to rebuild the shield. The aircraft carrier was a city of steel, but it was a city that breathed through its magazines and supply lines. The engagement had proven that the ship could survive a direct assault, but the cost of that survival was a dwindling resource that could not be replaced in the middle of a combat zone. The logistics of defense were just as critical as the tactics of the intercept, and every sailor on board knew that the next 8 minutes could come at any time. 6:45 in the morning, the North Arabian Sea. The 4 FA-18 Super Hornets of Strike Fighter Squadron 147 were already screaming down the waste catapults of the USS Carl Vinson before the last of the drone debris had even settled beneath the waves. The drones had been the primary gambit, a massive electronic and kinetic diversion intended to blind the strike group. But the secondary threat was now emerging from the morning haze. 12 Iranian fast attack craft, high-speed boats armed with heavy machine guns and short-range anti-ship missiles were closing the distance from the northeast at a speed of 45 knots. The air above the flight deck was a chaotic symphony of steam, screaming jet engines, and the sharp, nose-stinging scent of burnt JP-5 fuel. As each fighter cleared the bow, the pilots immediately banked toward the incoming surface contacts. Their APG-79 active electronically scanned array radars slicing through the maritime clutter to lock onto the small, fiberglass hulls bobbing in the swells. "Vinson, this is Raven 1-1. The flight lead called out, his voice steady against the heavy G-forces of the climb. "We have a positive ID on 12 Boghammer-class fast boats. They are maneuvering in a staggered line formation, latitude 24 degrees 45 minutes north, longitude 59 degrees 22 minutes east. They are presenting a hostile profile." The fast boats were an asymmetric nightmare. Small, agile, and difficult to hit with large-scale shipboard missiles, they relied on swarm tactics to get close enough to fire shoulder-launched rockets or light anti-ship missiles at the carrier's waterline. On the bridge of the Carl Vinson, the captain watched the surface search radar. The drones had forced the ship to expend its air defense missiles. Now, the fast boats were testing the ship's ability to project power onto the surface. "Raven Flight, you are cleared hot," the tactical action officer responded. "Neutralize the lead elements of the surface. Formation. Weapons free." Inside the cockpit of the lead Super Hornet, the pilot selected his air-to-ground ordnance. He lined up the crosshairs of his targeting pod on the lead boat, which was trailing a long, white plume of wake behind its twin outboard motors. The pilot's thumb moved to the red button on the control stick. The trigger was squeezed. The AGM-65 Maverick missile shrieked off the underwing rail, a white column of fire punching backward through the humid morning air. The rocket motor ignited with a sharp, physical crack that vibrated through the airframe of the fighter jet. The missile dived toward the water, its infrared seeker locked onto the heat signature of the lead boat's N. straining engines, leaving a thin, spiraling trail of white smoke against the blue of the Arabian Sea. The Maverick missile punched straight through the fiberglass hull of the lead Iranian boat, detonating its 57-kilogram high-explosive warhead directly in the fuel storage compartment. The boat did not simply sink, it was obliterated instantly. A fireball 3 stories high erupted from the center of the vessel, sending pieces of the engine and the hull flying 40 meters into the air. The shockwave turned the surrounding water into a circle of white foam, and the lead boat vanished from the surface in less than 3 seconds, replaced by a boiling slick of black oil and burning gasoline. The remaining 11 boats reacted in a panicked, disorganized surge. They broke their formation, zigzagging violently across the waves to avoid the next strike. Several of the Iranian crews began firing 23mm cannons into the sky, the green tracers arcing harmlessly thousands of feet below the circling Super Hornets. One boat attempted to launch a shoulder-fired missile, the small rocket motor fizzling out as the pilot executed a high-speed brake to the left, dropping a flare that burned with a blinding white intensity. 2 more Maverick missiles found their marks in rapid succession. The sea was now a graveyard of burning fiberglass and twisted metal. The surviving boats, realizing the protective umbrella of the drone swarm was gone, and the air was owned by the Americans, cut their throttles and turned back toward the Iranian coast, their high-speed retreat leaving a frantic, jagged wake behind them. Raven 1-1. Targets are breaking contact, the flight lead reported. 3 confirmed kills. The remainder are retreating to the 12-mile limit, requesting permission to maintain a combat air patrol over the perimeter. Permission granted, Raven. The Vinson Bridge replied, "Keep them honest." Beginning replenishment operations. The surface threat had been neutralized as decisively as the aerial swarm, but the cost to the strike group's readiness was continuing to climb. The sun was now fully overhead, baking the flight deck and the sailors who worked on it. The carrier continued its relentless movement through the water, a steel island that had survived 2 separate waves of attack in less than 2 hours. The North Arabian Sea was quiet again, but the horizon remained a line of tension that no one on board the Carl Vinson was ready to ignore. 9 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea. The USS Carl Vinson sat steady at 10 knots, the massive hull cutting, through a sea that was now as calm as glass. To the south, the supply ship USS Arctic had finally closed, the distance to within 2 miles, its deck stacked high with the white-painted canisters of replacement missiles. The replenishment at sea was a vital necessity. The strike group had survived the morning, but its magazines were dangerously low. The air was hot, the temperature climbing toward 35 degrees Celsius, and the smell of the sea was mixed with the lingering, chemical scent of spent explosives. On the bridge, the captain received the final damage assessment report from the executive officer. "Final tally is in, sir," the officer stated, reading from a digital display. 124 inbound drone contacts detected, 124 destroyed. We had 3 leakers enter the inner 5-mile zone, all neutralized by the close-in weapon systems and the rolling airframe missiles. On the surface, 3 Iranian fast boats are confirmed destroyed, with 9 retreating to their territorial waters. The cost to the United States was measured in hardware and fatigue rather than lives. There were 0 fatalities among the 5,000 sailors of the Carl Vinson. 7 personnel were treated for minor injuries, mostly bruises and lacerations sustained during the high-speed emergency maneuvers. The ship's primary radar remained fully operational, though the portside close-in weapon system mount required a full barrel replacement due to the extreme heat of the 8-minute engagement. The financial expenditure of the defense was estimated at $265 million. The strike group had fired 72 Standard Missile 6 interceptors, 48 Standard Missile 2s, and 24 Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles. It was a staggering price for a single morning of combat, but the strategic objective had been achieved. Carrier Strike Group 1 remained a functional, lethal presence in the North Arabian Sea, and the international shipping lanes remained open. The Iranians were testing the shield, the captain remarked, looking out over the flight deck where a Super Hornet was being towed back to its hangar. They wanted to see if they could saturate us. They found out that the shield is made of more than just steel and computers. It is made of 5,000 sailors who did not blink when the sky turned black with drones. The strategic message sent to Tehran and the rest of the world was clear. Despite the low cost of the attackers, the layered defense of a United States carrier strike group remained the most formidable obstacle in modern naval warfare. The Vinson had not been forced to retreat. It had not been damaged. It had stood its ground in the face of a technological swarm and methodically disassembled it. As the first fuel lines were shot across the gap between the Vinson and the Arctic, the crew on the flight deck began the grueling work of reloading. The 8-minute battle would be studied in naval academies for decades, a case study in drone swarm, defense, and the logistics of high-intensity conflict. But for the men and women on board, it was simply Tuesday. The sun climbed higher into a cloudless sky, illuminating the debris that still bobbed in the carrier's wake. The North Arabian Sea was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic pumping of fuel and the mechanical hum of the elevators. The Vinson stayed on station, its presence a silent, ironclad guarantee of stability in a region that had never felt more volatile.